through different change processes in organisations. So with that in mind, I've chosen quite a cartoon I found quite funny anyway when I first saw it. But essentially, what organisations haven't had to change in the past year, even if we go before that, we've got this whole digital transformation, getting everyone online. That was something that most organisations were doing. People who resisted it, say like Blockbuster, you know, Netflix has now completely taken over and we don't have Blockbuster anymore, that kind of thing. So there's already a lot of changes happening digitally. And then the pandemic's kind of come in and we were given, I honestly can't remember, I feel like it was a week to then get online, work from home. And that has just kind of spun everything out of proportion and really stirred things up. So I guess my question is, you know, what organisations haven't had to change? I think I've asked people this just thinking like, who's going to catch me out? Who's going to think of one? But even things like Postman or Amazon, they've had to change. They've just had to change how they do things rather than not having people there. But I just think it's a really interesting cartoon. And you've got the guy there going, this pace of new normal is kind of freaking me out. And that is being kind of spun by the pandemic. But, you know, it's things, and this is what we're going into a breakup room near the beginning of this, just to kind of talk about how you guys have experienced it. But I know a colleague, when she saw this slide, said even food delivery slots, they all went in the UK like overnight, and there were these wholesalers who said, okay, well, we've got a load of food that we normally sell to restaurants, so overnight a lot of wholesalers created a website and they created a way to be able to carry on doing what they do, just in a different way. And I think that's kind of the amazing thing about us as human beings, being able to innovate and do something like that. But it has been caused by this massive shift in the environment. So this is my confused dog. I'm a dog lover and a cat lover, so I don't choose sides. But the only thing that appears to be constant is change. So I think the point is we've already experienced a lot of change within a year. I've written some down, you know, remote working, location, our work-life balance. You know, working in your bedroom is hardly like leaving the office at the door and going home and relaxing. Returning, technical requirements, needing to be on Zoom, juggling, perhaps if you've got your kids at home, kids' education with your work, then you've got people losing jobs, people feeling isolated. And now we've got this new thing of actually having to return to the office, having to go back to something we just kind of got used to. And when I talked to Jeff Tricky about this, he says it's kind of like you've been hit by a car in a way, and we've all just started to get back up again. And it's like it's now reversed back onto us. And I just thought that was quite a funny analogy, because it's now shifted, but back the other way. How are we going to return to work? And it's about understanding there's probably an onslaught of emotions going through people right now in this kind of constant change that's happening. Which leads me to kind of what's going to happen. We've been told, see, this is how bad I am with time, but whether it was a week ago or 10 days ago or something, by our government, we're all going to be back to normal in July. I mean, we don't know what that is. We don't know if it's going to happen. Some people are going, that's great. Some people are, that's absolutely not going to happen. But the point is, how will it happen, even if it does or doesn't? So we don't have a tried and tested model of change after a global pandemic. It's not happened before that we know of in an environment that there's digital transformation anyway, where we are all online. So essentially what's happening is questions are coming up. Do we return to offices as normal? Do we return wearing masks? I actually had a client the other day who works in New York, and they're allowed to go back to the office, but they have to wear a mask all day wherever they are, even if they're at their desk. You know, that will make some people feel really uncomfortable. Social distance desks. My brother works in the city in London, and he says they've got like yellow tape across desks now just to make sure that you are staying apart. That's one thing. We've got remote working. Are we therefore going to close offices? Are we not going to have any brick and mortar offices anymore? Or further redundancies, you know, yes, we're going to return, but actually when we do get back, what's that going to look like? Are they going to be able to keep everyone on? And I think the point I'm trying to make is there are a lot of questions we still need to ask that are ultimately still causing stress for a lot of people. that maybe we haven't really considered yet. It's kind of like, we're going to go back by July, and that's all we know so far. But there's just an abundance of things perhaps we haven't thought about. So that's my kind of point on everything that's changing, and there's so much, and that's coming from an emotional standpoint for people, but it's also coming from actually, how are we going to do this? How are we going to return? What's that physically going to look like? So it brings me to my point of, well, I'm talking about organisational change. What is it? This is actually what happens if you type it into Google. So it's the movement of an organisation from one state of affairs to another, and you can see it can be planned years in advance, or, and this is a bit I've highlighted, forced on an organisation. This has been forced on all organisations because of our shift in environment. But the point that you can spend years planning in advance just shows how complex this process is. And actually, this is something that we haven't been able to do. So if I look at different theories that are out there, so this is Armstrong in 2009, saying the process of achieving the smooth implementation of change by planning and introducing it systematically. I'm not sure how much of that has been going on, or whether we've been able to do that. Lewin's model, I think 1939, this is the really famous one, unfreezing, changing, freezing. Unfreezing, you know, that was like taking an ice cube and a laser gun and putting it on that ice cube in this scenario. It just really happened very quickly. And even this one, maybe less so, but Fincham and Rhodes, the process of organisational transformation, you know, I think these are all suggesting that there is a process that happens, there's a plan, there's a system that we need to put in place. And I guess the question is, are we really doing that? Are we taking that into account with something like this, where we don't know what's happened or what's going on? So what we want to do is almost like reset and give people a chance to find their feet, to be able to then move forward in this area where none of us have been before. And I know it's very soon in my talk, but I just think that now's a really good time to be able to discuss this in groups. So Julie will put everyone in breakout rooms, but really, I just want to know, you know, how did it feel for different people? You know, how did you react when this initially happened? Versus maybe now, how do you feel now about the return to work, or what could happen? Are they different? Is it the same? How has this actually affected your work that you do? I know some people, that there maybe have been redundancies, there'll be a lot of remote working, there'll be a lot of people maybe doing flexi work, depending on where you are in the world. And then this, for me, is just kind of like, I'd be really interested to hear, what strategies have you put in place? If you're a coach, you know, what have you kind of advised people to do? If you work for a bigger company, what have they asked you to do? I'd be really interested to hear what people are currently experiencing, so how it feels, but also what you're then being told to do by the organisations that you work for. So I think we're doing kind of like an 8-minute breakout room, so I can come back and just, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this at the very beginning. So we'll come back and then maybe share a few things. So Julie, shall I pass to you?
Yeah, so I've just opened those breakout rooms now, so it should pop up on your screen to join those.
Getting a few head nods, which is good. So I think I haven't put the questions in the chat, but the first one was, you know, how did those kind of sudden changes make you feel? How did you react? How did you react now? I don't know if any groups were able to discuss that, or if anyone's happy to share. Obviously, if you don't feel comfortable.
I think people all had different experiences initially, which was, I've noticed in the group I was in, which was very interesting. We were all coming from a somewhat different place. Yeah. So it was interesting the way, initially for me, I was just totally resistant to the lockdown. Yeah. So I felt that my freedom was being taken away and nothing was worth that. So that was my initial reaction. Everyone's experiences, though, was just so coming from a somewhat different place. Yeah, that was interesting.
That is really interesting, and we'll hopefully come on to that a bit later. But yeah, that's really great. Thank you.
I suppose in our group, where we spoke about the challenges, then the point was made that it's so long ago now when it kind of first happened, we're a year down the line. And I think the conversation maybe got round to taking control and taking back and the positives that have come out of it. And that ability maybe to get yourself to flip your thinking and to start thinking about the positives and the control factor.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been going on for a long time now. We've been exposed to it. You know, as I was saying, we're getting very used to it now. So yeah, taking back the control. And anything on, so any of the points, so how it made people feel, how did the changes affect your work, maybe? Any other people already?
In our group, I think it's fair to say that on the whole, people's experiences have been really positive. Okay. So one person has actually become qualified as a coach. Another person talked about how brilliant it was to finally have time with his family and how he felt really present with his family. And someone else talked about, you know, the myth of how the internet was going to change our lives in the 90s actually has somewhat come true now. It allowed us to spend more time with our families and work remotely, and certainly from my own perspective, not having to travel as much has been really positive. So while we all had, yes, of course, we had issues with it in terms of physical isolation, on the whole, our group seemed to find it really positive.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, without the internet, what on earth? I mean, we wouldn't be here right now, but what would we really have done? It's something we are so reliant on now, but it really has allowed us to, we're all kind of adapted to that digital transformation. Yeah.
We talked a bit about one person in our group had made the choice beforehand to work from home and had been relocated, and so was set up to get going. And for others in the group, you know, it wasn't a choice. It was, you know, thrust upon us like everybody else. And so there was a real difference in how we perceived the change. You know, if somebody had said 18 months previous to me, oh, you'll be working from home and you'll have some flexibility with, you know, childcare, etc. Taking the homeschooling out of it, would never have been in favor of that. But, you know, the difference between anger and frustration and actually this was my choice and now I'm just getting on with it and it's actually okay. And so that was a kind of a stark difference, I think, which we often see in change scenarios where you can offer some choice. The reaction is very different, even though the situation might be the same.
Absolutely. And we do perceive things differently. We do tend to react to things differently. And when we do talk about the Rich Lab Compass, that is something that we're looking at there. How do we react? And it's really important. I mean, already, I think every group has mentioned that. Everyone had something different to say, even if it was, you know, more positive in some, there were still reactions there. And I guess finally, before I move, I could just have this discussion for the next half an hour, but are there any strategies that companies have asked people to put in place this kind of return to work, or any comments people had on that point, if you had time to get onto it?
We talked a little bit about some of what my clients are doing at the moment, Louisa, which is really kind of surveying employees on the assumption of some type of hybrid working and seeking to understand, is the pattern of work going to be more or less office-based as opposed to office or virtual? And out of that, looking at, well, what to do with the space of work? You know, is it more about having bigger collaboration spaces for teams to come together, almost with the assumption that because there will always be somebody maybe not in the office at any one time, meetings will continue to have a very virtual nature to be more inclusive. And so actually using some of that data around work patterns to really look at, you know, the office space, what facilities are there, what's important, and then out of that, you know, how do you want to go about having booking systems, for example, so that you might have lower capacity in offices kind of as people return to work in a safe way? Because in some of the discussions I'm in at the moment, there is an assumption that employees, while might be dying to get back to work on one level, will also need a lot of kind of psychological safety around the return, and suddenly being back in the presence of others, not being allowed to hug your mother for a year, you know, almost the contrast psychologically in that, and how do we manage those types of transitions?
Absolutely, and I think you touched on it on there, or the kind of the point of this is there is a people side to all of this. There's the fact that, yeah, we need to go back to offices. What's that going to look like? Are we therefore going to have virtual meetings? I don't know, when we do the meetings, do we need a big office? Do we not need the office still? There are all those questions we talked about, but actually what's going on in the minds of people? People have lost loved ones. People have been through a lot. You know, where does that come into this kind of change process? That wasn't something maybe we considered as much when it was about digitally transforming. But now it's kind of a whole different ball game. So thank you so much for that. I'll just share my slides again. So going on from that, I think a lot of people spoke about reactions, different opinions, this idea of having no control. And actually what we kind of know from research is that when we see a kind of a threat of change as human beings, we have this unconscious process where we build up this defense mechanism and we go, oh, this is unfamiliar. I don't really like this, you know, this isn't great. And you try to block it without even knowing. And what's more unfamiliar than this scenario that not anyone here has been through before. So we have this unconscious process that we put into place. And when a change is uncertain or ambiguous, like this is, resistance to change is likely to emerge. So it almost is going to come hand in hand with the pandemic. And I think, Jane, I think you mentioned the resistance there in your group discussion. So essentially, a part of change is resistance. And Oreg, who created I'll talk about in a second, the resistance to change scale that we measured in our research, also did a meta-analysis where he looked at kind of 60 years of research into resistance to change. And often the typical focus is on how organizations prepare for it, how they implement it, how they react. But it's kind of like organizations. What does that really mean? Who's actually within those organizations when it's happening? And what they typically find as well, that the main determinant of success for a change process is actually how people react, and being able to react positively to change, and they're not aligning necessarily. So a big part of this reaction is perhaps this unconscious defense mechanism we put in place, where we're not too sure about what's going on. And that's almost instinctual as human beings. And that is this idea of resistance to change. And I think resistance can even come when something is in line with our interests. So that's why it's quite powerful. Even when it is in line with what we want or what we strive to attain, we can still resist it. And I think that's why it's quite powerful. So, sorry, I get distracted by the chat. Part of change is resistance. So the resistance to change variable that we looked at is in our study, which I'll talk about in a second, comes from Oreg in 2003, who wanted to look at resistance to change in terms of individual differences. So a lot of these measures were looking at situations or interests, but not actually what's going on with those individuals. So what he found were there were 4 kind of reliable areas to measure which create the resistance to change scales, which is so routine seeking, emotional reaction to the imposed change, cognitive rigidity, and then that short-term focus. So these kind of reliably measure resistance to change. And it's so important to have this scale because it really is the #1 reason for those change initiatives to fail. So what we want to get from this is, if this resistance to change can cause conflict between employees, between teams and departments, we really want to be able to maybe highlight it in that change process. So we want to assess as well if, or I wanted to assess if we can actually see this within people's dispositions. So that was kind of the next thing he wanted to look at. So before I say that, I just want to mention as well, resistance can very much be a good thing. It's there for a reason. It kind of is something we've built up as human beings and we've kept over time, and it allows, or it makes people listen and gather feedback from the people around them, which ultimately is going to create that better decision. It almost acts like a mirror to the people in leadership positions. Say, actually, people are pushing back. Why are they pushing back? So it can actually help prevent bad ideas from being implemented, but it can also help prevent good ideas from being implemented badly. So resistance isn't all bad. That's what I just want to get out there before we carry on talking about this, but it is going to make us stop and think. So knowing that it's one of the reasons that these change initiatives fail, which is ultimately what all organisations, as we've kind of established at the beginning, are going to have to be faced with now. How can we start to use this? So as I said, Ori wanted to see if there was a dispositional side to this, and found there were quite a lot of correlations with personality traits. So people who perhaps were higher on sensation seeking were less likely to resist change. And that came from that routine seeking side. They didn't necessarily need routine, they wanted new things. Someone who was high on risk aversion were more likely to resist change. Tolerance for ambiguity. If we were more tolerant for the ambiguous, the uncertain, we were less likely to resist change. So it started to get linked to these personality traits. And my kind of point here is that if we can help people to understand perhaps how they're predisposed to respond to different change process, we can help them through it, help them to kind of cope and understand that. So there's a big self-awareness piece here, supporting people through a change process, and therefore being able to know that who perhaps will struggle more or resist it, and therefore are they going to be helpful in highlighting something we might have missed. So knowing that that was linked to personality traits, and obviously we have our personality assessments here, we do a student sponsorship program, and in 2019, well, it was 2018 but written up in 2019, one of our students wanted to look at whether we can look at the risk type compass and resistance to change, and whether that's something that would correlate. So when we talk about the risk type compass, we're looking at decision-making part of personality. We're looking at personality through the lens of risk, how we weigh up risk and opportunity. So I'll go into that a bit more in my next slide, but essentially we know personality does play a role in how we're likely to perceive and react to the efforts of change agents. A lot of you even said in your discussion there were different reactions going on. So we can't now assume that change decision makers, and I've put that in quotes, so I think I've kind of made that up as a phrase, but people making these decisions on the changes, they're not necessarily viewing it all in the same way, reacting in the same way, and the change recipients won't be either. So really, is personality part of all this, and can we use it? So
Louisa, sorry to interrupt you. Do you mind if I just ask a question that someone asked me? Just would you be able to repeat the different scales that resistance was measured by?
yes, absolutely. I even noted them down because I can forget them. So we've got routine seeking. We've got emotional reaction to the imposed change. We've got cognitive rigidity, and then short-term focus. So it's OREG, O-R-E-G, in 2003, and the paper was Resistance to Change, Developing an Individual Differences Measure. If anyone wants the reference, I can send it to Julie as well to circulate. And it is actually a really interesting paper to read. It's really well written.
Thank you.
So yeah, what is the risk type compass now? I keep talking about it. Some of you will be aware, perhaps some aren't. So where we come at this is that decisions are never risk-free. Decision-making comes from weighing up risk and opportunity. So what we look at in the risk type compass is personality through the lens of risk, how we can understand our decision-making, where we kind of come from. So how are we going to perceive different scenarios, how are we going to react to different scenarios, and therefore how do we go about managing them? So there's a picture of brain on here. What we found is that what we're looking at in the risk type compass is the two decision-making parts of the brain. We have an emotional side to the brain, which is the oldest part. And it's looking at, being very emotional, seeing things as a threat, seeing things as danger. That's like our stress response, versus being calm, which would be down here in the composed risk type. So individuals who are an intense risk type, they tend to be more stress prone, but they tend to be more passionate and enthusiastic, showing a lot of emotion, investing a lot of emotion, but maybe feeling things quite strongly. And on the other side, you have the composed risk type, who are more calm, they are more kind of resilient. So I think for those who know the 5-factor model, we're talking about being kind of low on neuroticism there with the composed risk type. So there's an emotional side to our decision making, and then there's an analytic or a cognitive side to our decision making, which was what was developed later on. So people who are up here on the prudent risk type are going to be high on measured. So these individuals like detail, they don't like uncertainty or ambiguity. That makes them feel uncomfortable. People who are carefree risk types, they're on the daring end. So actually they almost like uncertainty in a way. They are very happy with change. They're comfortable, able to flex. They're quite curious, like to seek novelty. So we have this emotional side to our brains and our cognitive side to our brains, and these scales aren't related. So you can be anywhere in emotion and anywhere on cognition. But what we do with the risk type compass is we put one on top of the other, and then it acts as a magnet, pulling you around our compass into where you might fall. So therefore, where your disposition to risk is, and it is something that is stable over time. So it is a part of our personality, although it's, like I said, that decision-making part of our personality. So what this forms, and I know this is in a nutshell because there's a lot going on in the risk type compass, but what it forms is this compass graphic on the right. So what you have falling between, say, an intense and a carefree risk type is the excitable one, because they're a combination of both. So for those who are interested, we do have a lot more information on the risk type compass, but for the point of this presentation, the last thing I'll say is when we did this research, or when we do any research with the risk type compass, what we often find is that emotion is a really strong part of, for example, mental toughness was one research we did. So the emotion part of our decision making really kind of correlated with that, but cognition didn't as much. But what we found with this research with resistance to change is both did, and very strongly. So what can we kind of take from that? And before I kind of say what the research is, the last thing is that we have different risk perspectives. And I've just put a few kind of descriptors around the compass. And the point of it is to be able to know your own natural strengths in terms of how you're going to react and perceive things, but also to maybe understand those blind spot areas, maybe what we do less well, what we don't see. And often what we find in the compass is people who fall on the opposite ends will have completely opposite viewpoints. So you can already start to see maybe what that might look like when we return to work, if you've got two people who are coming from a completely different perspective. So one last thing to mention here is when we looked at where people in the population fall, there's around 10% of people in each risk type. From an evolutionary perspective, that's a really strong finding, suggesting there's a need for all these risk perspectives. There's a need to have them kind of as a part of our personality. So what did we find when we looked at that kind of risk perception and resistance to change? So from an emotional level, we found that people were more likely to resist change. So the more emotional you are, the more stress prone you are, the more likely you are to resist change, because maybe you just don't like it. There's this idea of a threat response. We're risk averse because we see things as a threat of loss or of danger. And from a cognitive perspective, what this is showing, again, people who are more measured, that was that prudent risk type, again, were more likely to resist change because maybe they don't understand it. It's uncertain, it's ambiguous, they can't control for it. And I know another group mentioned control. That's a big aspect of it for these prudent risk types. So we know that people who are more emotional are a lot more likely to resist change. People who are more kind of measured are more likely to resist change. So I know probably people going, okay, what's the point of that? So it's interesting to see that we already have different risk perceptions in this area. If I were to then combine being emotional with measured, you get the wary risk type. So these risk types fall at the top of the compass here. They're a combination of being emotional and a combination of being measured. So what they do is they combine really this kind of threat response or this kind of stress response, seeing things as fearful, with needing to get the details, to be analytical, to understand what's going wrong. So wary risk types like to be in control. So they're very alert to risk. They know precisely what they're going to expect, and therefore they have quite a small comfort zone when it comes to risk scenarios. Things that aren't familiar to them, they're going to find stressful, and they're going to want to know all the facts. And if I were to look to the bottom of the compass, you've got adventurous risk types. So like I said, the opposites are going to have opposite perspectives. So they combine this kind of calmness, which comes from the composed risk type, with being quite daring. So being open to new things, almost kind of liking change in a way. They might even sometimes at extremes look for risk scenarios, sensation seek. They quite enjoy that, and they combine it with a calm approach to doing so. So they're the least likely on the compass to resist change. So these are just two perspectives that we can take from this, but what does it mean when we're then looking at everything I'm talking about? So the pandemic and returning to work. Well, wary risk types, whether they resist change, is very likely to impact our return to work process. And that comes from, there's research which is longitudinal, and for maybe more of the psychologists on here, longitudinal research is much more rare. I think it's like less than 20% of our research is longitudinal, suggesting something does happen in the long term. So what they found from longitudinal research was that if a change process, if people go, oh, it's fine, they're just going to get over it, they don't. Over 3 years, they found that actually people got more annoyed with that change process. They actually felt more resistant of it over time. So we know that it will impact our return to work process if people do resist change. So with wary risk types, we want to be able to get them on board. So we want to show them our plans. We want to be able to give them an opportunity to speak up. It's not like forcing them to say something, you must tell me what you think, but it's giving them that opportunity, if they want to speak up, to have a focus group, to be able to say something that they want, because they might be seeing something that ultimately we don't. And if we can get them to feel like they're a part of it, giving them that control back that came up in the discussion, they're more likely to then become what we call a change cheerleader. So actually wanting to go along with the process. And ultimately, they're going to feel more comfortable when they come back to the office, whatever that looks like for that company. And if I then take that adventurous risk type, how do we go about applying that? It's not that adventurous risk types, they love change, so therefore we don't need to do anything about them. They still have areas we can look at. So they're going to be positively moved by this notion of shaking things up. They're probably going to be quite attracted to this change process. So you can use them as change cheerleaders initially to get people on board. However, we want to make sure they also understand the details of the change, following the structure more. Maybe these individuals aren't going to see any risks that come as part of the change. That's opposite to the wary risk type. So actually, we want to maybe get them to look at the details, because ultimately threat perception is probably something that is quite important in a time where we're going into a return to work process that no one's experienced before. So it's almost the opposite process with, say, an adventurous risk type. I can see things, sorry, popping up in the chat. So I've got, is the goal to reduce uncertainty? Absolutely. It goes back to my point of, sorry, that was a question in the chat, is the goal to reduce uncertainty? It goes back to my point where, gosh, I've just forgotten my point, but the goal with this is, yeah, sorry, we have this habitual defense mechanism that goes up, right? When it's unconscious, when we don't know something, when it's unfamiliar. So therefore, that's what we want to avoid. We don't want something to be unfamiliar. So with a wary risk type, even with the intense risk type, with the prudent risk type, give them a chance to familiarize themselves with that change process. That's what they're going to be more comfortable with when they return to work. And I've just given 2 examples around the compass from different risk perceptions, because they are the strongest findings in this research. But the point is that we all have a predisposition to risk, and some will view it more as danger and this isn't going to work out and oh my gosh, what could go wrong. Others perhaps are going to see it more as an opportunity. In that way, the adventurous risk types were probably those who saw the opportunity of working from home or started a new company in COVID. I heard a story of I think it was someone getting fined because they were making people pay like 50p for a pump of hand sanitizer in the street, you know, something like that. But they're probably those adventurous risk types seeing an opportunity in this scenario. And it's just vital to be able to understand that we are coming from a different risk perception when looking at this return to work. So it kind of begs the question, how people-centric are we really being if we know we are different, if we know we have different risk perspectives? We know that how important this reaction of recipients is to organisational change. So arguably, those organisations who go back, they're going to be the ones that put time and effort in are going to be the ones who maybe it turns out better in the long run from that longitudinal research that I brought up. So the answer is not a one-size-fits-all approach. You know, should we have no offices anymore? Should we not? That's all very functional, but actually, like I said, there's this whole other side to it. Which brings me to the point of who is in the room, which is kind of our thing that Jeff, Tricky and I talk about a lot. If you've got 10 people making the decisions on behalf of hundreds or thousands in an organisation, we want to understand where they're coming from. My point being, if you have a room full of people who maybe are more towards the bottom of the compass, who are more risk takers, are they really focusing in on the detail? Are they seeing that other side of the compass where people are going to need more control, are going to want focus groups, are perhaps going to want to get involved? Or the other way around, if you've got a group of people who maybe are more risk averse, are they going to innovate and change things up enough? Or are they going to be kind of maybe play it too safe? So knowing who is in the room making decisions on behalf of everyone else is really important. Are we representing the employees that we have? And finally then, just some ideas of people-centric strategies too. And this is just to support your change process. This complements it in a way. And this goes back to the question I just had about uncertainty. This is making things more familiar. So being consistent in our messaging, coordinating with different functions, departments, that's going to create that clear message, giving people an opportunity to be heard. Especially because what they say might completely change our process for the better. Maybe they've thought of something that we don't. If you put into place new technical systems, train people, because again, that's a familiarity thing, then we won't, not respond well because of it. Don't be afraid to use validated psychometric tools like the risk type compass. They can really help when highlighting the different perspectives that people have. The risk type compass is strength-based, so helping people cope is really what we're trying to get at here. And overall, just then being able to create the right environment for the right people. So however you do that, whether it's using a psychometric tool, but just asking people how they've gone through this, how it feels, how they reacted to it, can be a really good starting point. So I appreciate I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm happy to take any questions or any thoughts if anyone completely disagrees.
Louisa, that was really enjoyable. Thanks a million. I have a quick question. You never mentioned Meghan and Harry or Brexit, but I'm sure it was intentional. But I just had a curiosity, where do you lie on the risk type compass?
I am, it's like, we always joke, it's like an AA meeting. I am an excitable risk type. So I am a combination of emotion and daring. So very much wanting to be impulsive and open to new things, but also there's something in the back of your mind going, it could go wrong. So it's an interesting risk type. There's conflict there.
That's great.
So I suppose what we could do is maybe I'll kind of wrap up and then we can hang on for another couple of minutes in case anyone has any more questions. But thank you so much for that, Louisa. I found it really interesting, especially even just that piece of, we can resist change, even if it's in our best interest. I think that was a good little reminder to have. So thank you so much for hosting that. The study that Louisa mentioned by, is it OREG 2003, and that was put in the chat by Suzanne, and I can also put it up in the LinkedIn group afterwards, along with the slides and recording from today's session. I also popped a little link just to the risk type compass. So just if you are interested in it, if you want to, use it with your clients, or you'd like to get any more information on it, feel free to drop me an email or give me a call, or you can visit that link that was on in the chat. Just next month, we will be back again on the 7th of April, and my colleague Billy Byrne will be hosting. He is going to be talking about ethical leadership, dispelling some myths associated with ethics in organizations, and identifying what interferes with our ability to make ethical decisions. So I think that will be quite an interesting one as well. So thanks again to Louisa for hosting, and I suppose we can hang on then for another few minutes in case anyone has any questions.
And thank you
Thanks for joining us.
your contributions. Million.
Julie, there's one in the chat there from Rachel. What are your thoughts on this concept when working with different cultures when moving to another country?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually was talking to Jeff this morning about how we think risk type compass fits with situations. I was saying, different risk types will have had a different experience when it comes to the pandemic, for example. And what we our approach would be that, you're born with a temperament, but you are born into a culture or a society, and you grow up in different situations. So at the most basic, if you started learning to ride a bike when you were 3 years old, right now you're just going to jump on it and go riding around London in rush hour if you want to. If you've never ridden a bike before now, that's not in your risk comfort zone. It's something you're going to need to work on, no matter your risk type. Your risk type will affect the approach you take, but it's very much then going to be that you weren't exposed to it early on. So different cultures, you're going to be exposed to different things, different situations, but ultimately you kind of have that risk type that underpins it, and then your values, your culture, the situations, that starts to shape you and shape the different comfort zones that you have around different risk decisions. So I hope that answers that question. Yeah.
That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Louisa.
No worries. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Super.
Thank you.
And of course, the students hate this stuff, because part of the university experience is being on campus, dating, makeout sessions, et cetera, going to clubs, and all of that is gone.
Yeah.
And so they really want things to go back to normal, because that's part of the purpose of why they're there. And so some of the positive things that people commented on in the Zoom meeting have to do with home and being with family and stuff like that. These guys do not want to be with their family, right? And so,
Ronald, I think it's the same with people just starting a job.
Yeah.
It's not the same as people. It's similar.
Not being able to meet anyone when you start and everything. Yeah, I think there's so many, and we don't argue that you're a risk type and therefore nothing is ever going to change, because there are situations, and I think especially what I haven't mentioned at all is age, and I guess our brain, our prefrontal cortex develops or finishes developing in our mid-20s as men, maybe a bit earlier for women. So that would be when your risk type really probably starts to cement. Because when we're younger, we probably are a bit more daring, and that's why a lot of people are blaming adolescence for the spread of COVID and everything, because we are a bit more daring, we are a bit more open to kind of risking things. So that might be where that's coming from, and wanting, there's a whole student experience that they're not getting, and if you gets really dark if you look at kind of the suicides that's happening. It's awful when the people are being locked in their rooms and stuff. It's really hard.
no, Alan,
Thanks, Sorry.
go ahead, Alan.
No, Ronald, I would just say I was going to take a bite to Louisa, but please go ahead.
I was the person that said that finally the internet has fulfilled its promise, right? And so one of the great things about this situation is I'm involved in the improv theater community. And so now there are improv jams that I participate in I could do it every day, that connects people from India, Singapore, Philippines, Europe, the United States. And so now we get to intermingle and get to know all these different senses of humor, these different sensibilities and stuff. And that literally would never have happened before. There's an improv community in Bangalore, India, that's great, that has been around for 20 years, that I had no idea existed. And so there's been, real positive things because of this need to interconnect and we'll never go back.
No.
It's going to be hybrid from now on forever.
And that's, I think, when I started, I probably should have said I was choosing between two cartoons. So that one and one where there was a group of people in an office saying, oh, we should really talk about digital transformation. And the boss is going, we've got years. And COVID's in a wrecking ball. And it's obviously about to kind of just sweep through that office. And I think that's that side to it. It's just sped up everything. I mean, I didn't know what Zoom was a year ago. And I have spent days, if not weeks now on it for different scenarios.
Great. Cool. Again, thank you so much. This is really nice and concise and very informative and useful. So, and I'm a psychology professor, so this resonated a lot with me as well. So thank you very, very much.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
If I just may, and maybe briefly mention, because the professor has spoken about students, I think I suppose he was probably referring maybe to the younger student. I, on the other hand, would be probably quite a bit older than most of the students he's thinking about. And I just wanted to mention, I mean, at the moment, I'm following a postgraduate course somewhat related to the topics that we're talking about today. And I would not have been able to do this were it not for this current situation we're in, because the course as it was previously was all taught at lectures where one had to attend physically. My work involves a lot of international travel, so it just was not possible in the past to sign up for a program like that. So actually, this current situation has brought other educational opportunities for some people, I guess.
Definitely. I think, it's like I said, I don't know where we'd be without the internet in this pandemic. Now it's hit us now. But then maybe, it's spread so quickly as well around the world in terms of information, not the actual disease, but as well because of the internet. So it's just been completely different. And I couldn't imagine it without us having any internet. Even our company, we went all online overnight pretty much. A lot of people did. So I think it's great because you can, obviously the digital transformations come in because we can now have offices in different countries and work with people from all over. I could probably do a master's degree in the US or something online now, which is great. So I think in terms of like a postgraduate, I can see how hugely beneficial that would be. Yeah. And then you can also see as an undergraduate, the student experience side, and it's more undergraduate, definitely in England, it's just about growing up, isn't it? So that's what they're missing out on, the growing up side of it rather than the lectures.
And that's such a very important side though, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, for personal development, it really is just so important. Yeah.
Well, and seminars like these will not go away. I mean, this is such an amazingly great thing that I can be sitting here in Bulgaria and just dial in and hear a great lecture from people anywhere, right? So
yeah.
So that's why, and I'm glad that I've heard nobody say that we will go back to the old ways of just being IRL from now on. It's going to be hybrid, and the people that are best prepared to do that will really have an advantage. Probably starting in the fall, when things start to return more or less to normal.
And I mean, I do this more now than I ever have in my life. I'm going back to normal. So, that's what we're dealing with. And that's my point. There's no off-the-shelf solution. There's no catalogue that we can rip the page and go, this is what we're going to do with this organisation, because we need to know who we've got, who we're dealing with, and therefore how we can go back. Because it is going to take its toll on people emotionally. wherever they kind of fall on the compass. It's just a different side to emotions.
And it really does zero in all the way from the individual level, all the way up to the government and systems level, right? And they're all interacting, pretty radically and unbelievably fast. So,
yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thanks,
For staying
Louisa.
on, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Julie.
Everyone be
Bye
safe.
for now. Bye. Bye.
A practical approach, I suppose. You've talked, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much. You've talked about, I suppose, looking at how you implement this at a later date, getting buy-in from the employees. So how do you go about getting buy-in, not to the change piece, but to even implementing things like what you talked about there, the risk type compass? Maybe it's dependent on the type of company that you're working in, but in companies like construction, for example, it's often a difficult sale to talk about personality types and traits, and to really sell that as a tool to employees. Do you have any opinion on that or any guidance?
Yeah, I mean, me and Julie catch up a lot about, how we promote the risk compass, how we do it at PCL, how maybe Julie approaches it at Kinch Lyons. It's hard because a lot of people see personality, and I think probably the finance industry is a big aspect where they go, we actually developed the risk compass for financial advisors initially. So that's quite an interesting point to start with. But what we're looking at is decision making and how we can be most effective in our decision making. The reason it's called the risk compass is almost to shake up this idea of risk and say, actually, it's just every decision we make is risk. So making sure people understand we're looking at the decision-making aspect of our personality is really helpful to start with, because then we can understand our strengths. And actually, if we understand where we're coming from, we're more likely to understand where other people are coming from. And so I think in promoting it in terms of team dynamics and team workshops, that's where it has huge strengths. In terms of our team report graphics, that compass I showed you, you fall in it as a red dot. But if you're 10 people, you've got the 10 red dots on it, and you can really visually see the different ends and where people are. So I think getting people to understand, first of all, it's a decision-making tool. We all have different perspectives when it comes to making decisions. And you saw that from the breakout rooms, how everyone say, yeah, we actually approach this really differently, which was what I was hoping would come out of it. But then saying in it, being able to understand how we approach things helps us to be better equipped in this scenario, coping, in bringing our strengths to what we do. And then therefore it's about, we can then place ourselves in terms of who we work with and the teams we're in. And it doesn't matter what industry now, we have applications across industries. And if you need any information on what industries or case studies we have, I'm sure Julie will be able to send that to you, but it's just so widely applicable now. When we started really niche in the finance industry for financial advisors, and now it is in a lot of different industries. Like there is a board of directors I'm working at the moment in the construction industry in a company in Europe. And, it's just interesting for them to see that, to understand their risk culture. I know that's kind of, I don't know whether how was specific enough to help answer that.
No, absolutely, it is. I think it feels like coming from different backgrounds, and I suppose working in a financial institute and moving over into construction, I can see the huge change and the difference in approach that you need to tackle these change management pieces. So I was just curious, but no, that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries.
If I could just even add, something that I would often think of when people have that resistance to it is just, if you can't measure this, you can't manage it, and if you're just kind of saying, yeah, I think we understand it, what's the evidence, and using a framework can really just shine a spotlight on certain areas that you want to understand more about. So like you said, if you're trying to understand decision making and our preferences, it's about really investigating and being a bit proactive as much as possible, rather than just kind of like, oh, we made this decision, not really sure exactly why, okay, we'll try it differently next time. Whereas if there's actually the work put in advance, people can be a bit more proactive about their their approach to decision making and have that framework.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, no worries.